Hello, good morning, and welcome. Hopefully, everybody can hear me. It's always fun doing these virtual presentations. You never quite know if you're on mute or if you're actually reaching the audience. I am Hillary Hauser, and I'm a senior director here with MRA. I oversee our HR services and affirmative action services. And I'm really excited to be here this morning with all of you and with Shamara Lockwood, who's the lead recruiter and HC generalist for Lutheran Social Services of Wisconsin and Upper Michigan. Shamara has a lot of experience in affirmative action and leading programs for Lutheran Social Services. She also is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin Parkside and has a degree in business and human resources and then also English. And over the last 10 years, she has worked in a lot of different industries, most recently landing with Lutheran Social Services. And what I find really interesting right now, Shamara, is how incredibly busy you are with hiring people. It is very, very busy in her industry. So Lutheran Social Services services about 30,000 clients in their geographies with 200 different programs. And in a year, they hire about 400 people. So I think all of you on the phone are probably having that jaw drop moment where you're thinking, how are you hiring 400 people in this market? And so today, Shamara is going to share a little bit about some of the success that they've been having with their affirmative action plan and really bringing it to life as they're managing it. We're going to open it up for questions. So we've got about a 10 to 12-minute presentation from Shamara. I'm going to put slides up shortly, and then we'll open up for question and answer. There are a couple different ways that you can submit questions. We really prefer you use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We have a moderator who will be viewing everything and sharing questions with us once we open it up. And then feel free to use chat if you want to comment on something that's working for you. I'm sure others in this presentation would also really enjoy to see it. So with no further ado, Shabara, I'm going to hand over to you, and I am going to share our presentation here.
Great. Thank you, Hillary. I'm excited to be here this morning. As Hillary mentioned, I lead the talent acquisitions team for LSS, and we stay really busy. Been with the organization about 8 years and have been a part of that affirmative action process during that entire time. And the last 3 years have led that process for LSS. Partnering with MRA. So excited to talk to you today about the best practices really to make your affirmative action program come to life. We're going to focus on, slide please, Hillary. We're going to focus on data integrity, internal implementation of your affirmative action plan, and that's really where I want to spend a good portion of our time today. Outreach and good faith efforts, and then as well as a compensation review. We'll touch on that briefly. So focusing on that data integrity, certainly what kinds of data are you gathering? You know, it's termination logs, internal transfer logs, all of your employee data, application logs, termination logs, transfer logs, promotion logs. That data has to be clean in order for whether you're doing that internally or you're partnering with MRA like LSS does on your affirmative action plan. But in order for that information really to be the most credible, that data really has to be clean. Certainly reviewing that data monthly can be helpful, but certainly developing a consistent process is probably the biggest thing I can recommend to you. How are you dispositioning folks? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. How are you training your leaders? How are you auditing that information throughout the year? And then continuing education. If things are changing, are you updating your leaders on those? Are you continuing to provide good training? Keeping in mind, you know, that again, colleagues' data have to be up to date. Are you inviting your colleagues at least annually to update their data in your HRIS system? We tend to do that right around the time that we're getting ready to do W-2s. So come December, we're going to send that invite out. Encourage folks to review all their information. Has their disability status changed? Are people now willing to disclose a disability that they weren't previously? All of those kinds of things. Dispositioning, huge, huge, huge. Why? Because this is, again, what is used to, as they're looking at application logs. Um, where are people stopping in a process? Why are they stopping at that process? Again, you're going to use that data to put together that affirmative action report. Slide, please, Hillary. Thank you. Um, thinking about the internal implementation of your affirmative action plans, policies, procedures. Again, these things are used to help internally steer that plan and also steer your hiring practices. What's your applicant policy? Do you have an application policy? Um, Equal opportunity and employment policy, your internal transfer policy, all of those things, again, are going to be used and helping guide that affirmative action process. Training your leaders is absolutely critical. Um, Number one, it's to ensure consistency in processes, everybody doing this things the same way. If you have one leader who's dispositioning different than another, again, that data is not going to be as clean. It's not going to be as consistent. I actually have a manual put together for my leaders, cheat sheets for dispositioning, so that they can't really screw that up and they have something there to refer back to. Consider developing a formal pay structure to ensure that all of your colleagues are compensated equitably. Pay is a component of your affirmative action plan. They're going to look for any um, adverse impact. And that comes down to pay as well. If you at least have pay structures, pay bands, salary grades, however you choose to title those within your organization, it's going to help guide your talent acquisitions folks to extending offers that are going to be free of any bias. Um, and then again, ongoing training. I cannot stress that enough, whether that's of your talent acquisitions folks or your hiring leaders. Stakeholder engagement, and I think this is probably one of the biggest areas that LSS really does well when it comes to ED&I, and that is having senior leadership really championing these efforts. So our ED&I committee, we have a senior leader who sits on that committee, C-suite, and then other leaders as project managers on that team. Really getting that buy-in from your leadership team is going to be absolutely critical. HC or HR cannot be the only one spearheading these efforts. You have to get that buy-in from your leaders. And it starts from the top, right? So if those senior leaders are saying that these things are important, the hiring managers are going to follow suit. So certainly making sure you have that buy-in. Sharing your affirmative action goals with your hiring leaders. Um, if they don't know what the goals are, they can't help you reach them. So all other things created equal, how are they going to look at hiring that diverse candidate? Again, they need to know what those goals are to do that. We begin our recruiting process with a strategy call. And during that strategy call, we discuss with those hiring leaders what types of resources or outreach we may do in order to reach a diverse clientele. In some areas of the state, that might be connecting with the business services rep at DWD, that might be working with DVR, that might be working with tribal communities. Think about what kind of diversity is needed within a specific team. Um, Gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, all of those things, right? We come with our own unique gifts. Um, and we want to have that diversity in thought within our own teams as well. So not only think about diversity within your organization, but think about diversity within your team, and what do we need to do in order to bring in and attract that added level of diversity. Um, have your recruiters focus on D&I outreach. In our team, we actually separate out the different classes, protected classes that we're trying to attract. So I have a recruiter who works specifically on veterans. I have a recruiter who works on attracting minorities, another who focuses on individuals with disabilities, and we divide and conquer that way. And really, it's all about building meaningful relationships. Um, Certainly, sending your jobs over to a group is great, but are you having those conversations, talking about how you might be able to help them, and how they might be able to help you? um, a lot of times, it's really that partnership and that relationship that takes those efforts to the next step. Um, Reporting, again, think about all those logs, hire logs and applicant logs, and tracking those goals. Keeping in mind that. Uh, they're goals, they're not directives. You're likely not going to reach every affirmative action goal that you have for the year. So, the biggest thing I can encourage you to do is track that progress year over year. Don't just look at your goals from this year. See where were you at 5 years ago? When I first started working with LSS, we um, had about 6 affirmative action goals. Um, for minorities and for women. Today, we're down to 3 goals. Um, so over the course of the 8 years I've been here, we've really been able to move the mark by focusing on these core strategies. Um, Consider the availability makeup of uh, your organization. Where are you actually hiring? Are you really recruiting through the entire state of Wisconsin or Illinois or Minnesota where you're at? Or are you focusing on a specific geographic area? I will tell you, we did a very thorough analysis of where geographically we were recruiting for specific roles, and I was able to work with MRA so that our availability analysis was very clean. That changed our goals, and it gave us a clearer look at what that picture really was, which was helpful for us because a lot of the recruiting that we do is in some very, very remote areas. And so we're not going to get the same level of diversity in Wittenberg as we do in Milwaukee. Um, Consider reviewing your job descriptions to make sure that those are free from bias and discrimination, even unconscious bias. If you're using he throughout your job description, that alone could discourage women from applying for your opportunity. Um, Something to think about there. Write those job descriptions based on qualifications and competencies, again, to help eliminate unconscious bias. And use competency based behavioral interviewing techniques so that you're focused specifically on what those individuals have done, and not necessarily on those other things that attract us, right? I know myself that if I see a grad from UW Parkside, I feel kind of kindred to that individual right away because we've gone to the same school. But using competency-based interviewing, it allows me to really focus on, does this person have the skills, knowledge, abilities that I need for them to be successful in their role? And then consider incentivizing staff for referring folks to help reach those affirmative action or DE&I goals. Um, One of the things we're really focused on this year, and I'm sure will continue, is looking at how our employee population reflects our client population. And so we want to have those things be as reflective as possible as we're going out into the community. So, how do I attract a diverse colleagues? We know some of our best colleagues come from employee referrals. So, letting those folks know if you refer someone to us that helps us reach those affirmative action goals, then we're going to give you an additional incentive or additional referral bonus for helping us do that. So it's something to think about there. Thinking about internal outreach and good faith efforts. Next slide, please, Hillary. Again, for those internal things, you're looking at your employee information, your internal applicant log, your promotion log, your termination logs, your transfer logs. Um, again, focusing on those goals and the availability here within your organization. But how are you making sure that everyone within your organization is aware of opportunities to continue to grow and advance their career? One of the things I ask leaders to do when they're hiring for a new position on their team, a promotional opportunity, is to make that announcement to their entire team. Um, that way I'm not going, to a specific individual and saying, "Hey, I really think you'd be a great fit for that role." Now, I may still have that conversation with folks, but I've also made sure that the entire team is aware that that opportunity is available and that they should consider applying. And then our policy is that we're just going to interview anybody who's qualified for the role. Um, and if we choose not to interview you, we're gonna have a conversation about why we chose not to do that and what things we can do to help that individual get to the next steps. So it doesn't have to be a place where it then ends up being with some awkward conversations. Um, it's all in the way that you frame those things, but making the opportunity available to everybody, absolutely critical. Um, Again, reminding your colleagues that you are an affirmative action employer, that the information that we're collecting is confidential. And if they're having questions, to bring those questions to us. Certainly, we want to know if there are concerns within the program, but also in making sure that we're collecting data and being mindful about how we're doing that. And then again, having a consistent process. I cannot stress that enough. Um, I think one of the things the leaders appreciate on in my organization is that it doesn't matter if they reach out to me as the talent acquisitions manager or if they reach out to one of the recruiters. The experience, we may have some nuance, but the experience should pretty much be the same. The process is the same. And so we can very clearly demonstrate that there's a lot of consistency that helps us ensure that we're making smart, equitable decisions when we're hiring. And then find ways to engage your current workforce and bring that affirmative action or ED&I to life in your workplace. For us, that's an ED&I committee. We just had our development week. That committee presented to our entire organization. Um, Bringing any questions, concerns, all of those things to that committee for review and comment really makes people feel included. And when they know what's going on and they feel included, they're definitely more engaged. And so I say all this to really take you down to kind of the big five, if you will. Number one, and slide please, Hillary. I'm going to ask you to weave compliance really into your daily HR practices. Dispositioning, consistency, training, absolutely, absolutely critical. Actively monitor your data and reports. If your system, I will tell you, our system won't allow us to change anything now that once a requisition is closed. So we have to be very diligent when we're closing our requisitions. But some of your ATSs may allow you to go back and update dispositions. Um, My old system did. I would run those reports quarterly and then update the data, make sure it was as clean as possible. Um, Again, engage those stakeholders along the way. Engage your hiring leaders. Engage your colleagues. Um, Again, referrals probably the number one way I and recruiting um, folks who will stay with us long term. Be actively involved in the communities that you're serving. Certainly, those partnerships with other community based organizations, with again, tribal communities. We partner with Central Hispano, with UMOS in Milwaukee, working with the African American Chamber of Commerce. You know, what organizations can you be a part of and be involved in to really help spread the word about your organization and recruit and retain uh, diverse talent. Remember to engage those stakeholders along the way. Um, and again, align affirmative action with your diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Um, I think that's the only way to really make that come to life and to feel like you're making progress on more than just a plan. It has to be a cultural thing. Um, and so I think that's one thing LSS is really doing is we're saying, you know what, this is who we are. Um, and we want to make sure that we're being inclusive for everyone.
Shamara, thank you so much for going through this. I know that it's kind of fast and furious, especially for those of you who are on the um, session. Affirmative action is pretty complex, right? We all know that if we've been working through it. There's the data side of it, there's the culture building, there's the weaving it into diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. There's just a lot of different facets of affirmative action. And I've been doing it for about 15 years myself and working first within an organization and getting to see the implementation like you're doing. And you're doing so many really interesting things. And there were a couple of things that I feel like you're doing unique. We don't see a lot of organizations doing it. So the first thing I wanted to tap into and ask just a couple more questions was about your referral program. So referral programs, right, are exciting because typically if you have a really good employee and they're referring somebody, you know that they're going to likely have some tenure. The challenge of referrals is we often refer people who are like ourselves. So if you have a predominantly, homogenous population, that can be a challenge. You mentioned that you have a referral program for people who are referring diverse talent. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Maybe just how you kind of talked about it with your senior leaders and got the buy-in for that program?
Absolutely. So I actually got the idea in an EEOC webinar um, during Black History Month. They pulled folks together, and there were probably about 1,000 people on this call, different thought leaders throughout the country. And this was one of the ideas that they came up with is how are you incentivizing folks to attract diverse individuals to your organization. And I remember sitting down with our HR director, and the first thing they said was, how do we do that and it not be discriminatory? Um, and having given it some thought, and I expected that question, I said, you know what? We're an affirmative action employer. We tie that to our affirmative action goals. We know those are very concrete. Um, that and it's not a secret that we're trying to reach these goals, right? So we said, okay, what are those affirmative action goals for us? That's there have been times when that's minorities in the professionals category. It might be veterans across the board, folks with disabilities. And so what we do, every new hire, number one, we advertise that right to our team. So article went out in our newsletter that goes out monthly. Actually, I'm due to send one over to marketing again today, just for this purpose. So we do all of that, advertise, make folks aware, but then make sure that every single individual that we hire receives an employee referral form in their new hire paperwork. So they fill that out automatically. When that person starts, that form actually comes to me for analysis. So I'll go through and say, okay, here they are. I will look at their protected information. Are they in a protected class? And is that something, one of our goals that we're focused on? So this will change annually. It requires whoever's doing that review to be aware of what those goals are. And if that individual does help us reach those affirmative action goals, our normal bonus our referral bonus is $500 bonus, and that's paid out $250 increments quarterly is the way we do it. Incentivizes folks for sticking around too, right? So if you refer someone who helps us reach those goals, we'll give you an extra $250. So that $500 referral is now a $750 referral bonus. Yeah.
Well, and I think that that kind of is one of the critical parts is that you're not decentivizing people to refer just in general, but there's just a little bit of an added element if they are referring somebody on one of the areas in your affirmative action plan. And when we were preparing for the Shamar, we talked a lot about attorneys, right? Because there you can get yourself into a lot of sticky situations with affirmative action compliance. And so I always like to think of kind of that common sense rule. If you think that somebody might take exception to it, or if you think that it might get you into a little bit of potential trouble, it never hurts to run it by either your senior leadership team or even an attorney as you're looking at different programs, just because there are a lot of nuances, especially when you talk about all of the data that you're pulling together. And in your situation, one of the key takeaways I have is you're only seeing that protected information. And so it's not as though somebody, referring an individual wouldn't absolutely know. It's likely they would, right? Because they would know the person. But disability and even veteran status, those are two that can be, non-apparent. And so they're not making any judgments, and you're not going back to them and saying you hired them and they here were their protected statuses. So you're insulating all of the parties from that actual protected information.
Absolutely. And even the form that we use, I don't have to indicate which areas of diversity that individual hits. So even within our own HC department, so that all goes to payroll when we're done, all I have to say is, yep, they met that criteria, sign off and send it over. So we're very careful of making sure that we're insulating that protected data, because we don't want there to be, of course, any discrimination or anything like that because somebody is aware of that protected class. But at the same time, if we can incentivize staff to send us diverse folks, that's what we want to do.
Excellent. And then the other piece that resonated with me, and of course, I love the data side of it, and I get to see a lot of data. But what you mentioned about really being strategic with setting up your availability when you're creating your affirmative action plan, I feel like is really critical. We look at it with our members most of the time on an annual basis, just because, to your point, recruiting can change. We know there's new census data, sort of census data that's out with the 2018 American Community Survey, new census codes. So we feel like it's really important to look at that. And I'm glad to see that it really has made a difference for you. And we often forget that internal movement is equally important. So if you have situations where you most likely are going to be promoting or moving up within the organization, we want to make sure we get that balance right of external hiring versus internal hiring. So it's special, I think, when talent acquisition leaders like yourself are involved in conversations because you have that insight. So my one takeaway for those of you on the session who are generalists and maybe aren't involved in recruiting is bring your TA person in if you're not already, because I think they can give you some really valuable insight as to where they're actually seeing candidates and where they're actually able to get some qualified candidates from.
Yeah, and at LSS, about 30% of all of our jobs are filled by existing staff members. Um, and number one, I think that is a good way or a good measure of saying we're going to invest in our employees, right? We want them to grow in their careers with us. Um, but again, we want to make sure that everyone is aware. So making those announcements within a hub office. I've seen or I've had leaders do that. If we thought, oh, we have 200 programs, we may have good talent in a different program and not even realize it. We advertise that, and again, in our monthly newsletter, we all pick, specific jobs that are hot for us, and we make sure that um, those are all advertised. So for that internal hiring piece is critical. But I will tell you, Hillary, when I looked at the first year I took over leading our affirmative action efforts, we were looking at availability, and I have lots of job titles all over the state. And we would say care coordinator. Oh, we hire for that statewide. Well, really, we don't. We have those programs in Chippewa Valley and in Appleton and the Fox Valley, right? And I said, no, well, we're not really going to hire for that statewide. We're going to hire for that role in either Eau Claire or Appleton. That drastically changed our availability because all of a sudden we weren't looking at populations from Metro Milwaukee and Madison anymore. And so that availability rating, absolutely critical. Are you really pulling from the right geographic areas? We saw big changes in our outreach right away with that change.
So when you are working on the disposition codes, and I know this is a question that came and I happen to see it out of the corner of my eye, and it's another area that's near and dear to my heart is disposition codes when you're looking at applicants. And I think, the number one thing that we talk about is make sure your job descriptions are accurate, make sure you're reviewing them on an annual basis. It is part of your obligation under the plan creation and executive order 11246, have to flex, right, that regulation in there. We adhere to that pretty specifically. Um, but there is room for a lot of flexibility in how you structure disposition codes. And are there ways that you work with your recruiters to make sure that they're really consistent in how they're applying it? Because I'm guessing that you do look at how people are falling out in your process and saying, why didn't we interview XYZ if it looked like they met the basic qualifications? Or why didn't they move forward after a phone screen? So tell us a little bit about how that works for you in practice.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right. We are going back and looking at them. I'll say typically it's not my recruiters, it's my hiring leaders who are choosing not to move forward. And so sometimes those can be a little more challenging conversations, right? When you're asking your leader, why did you choose not to move forward with that individual? But in practice, number one, we every application is reviewed by hand at LSS. So I don't have an automated system that is going to automatically disqualify somebody. I'll get a trigger if it's like an education thing, but generally speaking, every application is reviewed by hand. Number one, we're people. Applicants are people. I tell people all the time, if you looked at my own resume when I first started at LSS, I was a non-traditional student and had a huge gap, and then took temp jobs. I was like, so I looked like a job hopper. If I looked at my own resume, I wouldn't have hired me. I probably would have skipped over. So I always remind myself, I actually use my resume and my training with my leaders and say, okay, would you have hired this person? Here's their background. And then when I tell them that that person is me, they're like, oh my gosh, how we would have missed out. Um, so I think, being open minded, reminding your leaders to be open minded. Nobody knew I stayed home for 8 years with my kids and went back to school. I mean, and I learned a lot of skills during that time. So, certainly be open minded as you're interviewing. Better just to have a conversation And that's really what I tell my recruiters is I'd rather you pick up the phone, have a 5-minute conversation with that candidate and get clarity and how you want to move forward, than screen out. And then when it comes to dispositioning, so where do recruiters disposition? We use if then statements. So we say, if they're in the phone screen, then and they stopped at that spot, why did they stop? So that's what your disposition code is going to be. Oh, they stopped because they have insufficient skills for the job. They have poor interpersonal skills. They have lousy work history, whatever those things are. And again, I do the same thing with our hiring leaders, where that first is. So we use they call them recruiting steps and move reasons in UKG. So that recruiting step is, where did they stop in that process? Phone interview, on-site interview, references, whatever. And why did they stop there? Because again, that's what we really want to see. Keep in mind, anybody who's not qualified, those applications, you don't actually have to count them in your affirmative action plan. But if they're not accurately dispositioned, they're going to be added into your numbers, which may or may not be accurate. So making sure that you're doing that consistently across the board is really key. And again, I have a cheat sheet for my leaders and my recruiters. So I give that to them regularly and remind them, here's how I want you to do this. And if you have questions, call me, because it takes me 2 minutes to do it. It may take me 40 minutes to fix your mistake. So just those conversations.
Yeah, and that training, you go back to that training a lot and just those constant communications that you have back and forth with your team. And I do find that is incredibly valuable because nothing is cut and dry. And so um, everybody has slightly different interpretations when they look at resumes, even though we know we have basic qualifications, we know we have preferred qualifications, and some of them are pretty easy. But when you do really start to dig into backgrounds, people don't put everything in a resume. People, may complete an application wrong online. I think we're seeing that because there's just so many different types of application systems that employers are using. And then the last piece of it is non-traditional talent. So thank you for bringing that up as well. We've had a couple of different conferences where we've talked about non-traditional talent and how to bring people into the organization. That also requires some creativity when you're structuring your job descriptions. So I feel like what you've been doing by looking at your disposition codes could really help better define and debias what your job descriptions look like. So as a takeaway for anybody on this call, that is one thing that we have found for most organizations to be incredibly helpful. Not only does it bump up your applicant flow because you have a better written job description with more clear qualifications, you tend to get better qualified applicants for that job because it's exactly what you're looking for. So things like lifting requirements, even language in your job descriptions around must have eyes to see computer, must have hands to type, right? Those are outdated. We know there's a lot of different technology capabilities right now. And are you screening somebody out who might have a disability because of the way that you're framing up some of the requirements of the job or some of the physical requirements? We have a fair amount of questions. So I think, and we also have a fair amount of time. So that's the good news. But I think what we'll do is shift over to some questions. And then if we have a little bit of time at the end, we can come back and talk about some of the other highlights of your presentation.
Right.
Great.
Okay, good morning. Let's start with this question. When you're doing as much hiring as you are, Shamara, are you using all of your reports out of your HRIS system, or do you have other methods that you use to pull that data?
Yeah, most of our reports are pulled right out of our HRIS. We're very lucky. We have a very talented gentleman on our team who leads our HRIS and payroll efforts. And yeah, we're able to pull everything out straight out. But what's important there is that the data is clean when it goes into the system. Because if that data is not clean and he's pulling that report, let's say it's applications. And I remember when I first started at LSS, our data was not as clean as we would have liked it to be. And then at the end of the year, and we weren't doing it quarterly, we were doing it annually. It was like, okay, here's all of these apps that don't have disposition codes. Now we have to guess. And so I think everybody got others better qualified who didn't have a disposition, because at that point, I didn't have any other information without going through 4,000, 5,000 applications by hand. So I can't stress that enough, making sure your data is absolutely clean. Now, other ways you could do, I've had folks just use Excel, track as the information, set up your columns in Excel and track that way. If one person's doing it, maybe not so big of a deal. But if you've got multiple people, like on my team, there's 4 of us who could be recruiting at any given time, a little bit harder to manage. So I would say definitely if you can pull reports out of your system, that's going to be the easiest way to do it.
Yeah, and I agree. Excel can be tricky, especially because it just further amplifies the keying errors. But if you do use Excel, minimize the disposition codes that you have. We actually have a kind of a modified list of disposition codes that we encourage the companies we work with to use, because then there's not so much variability. So I'm happy to share that if anybody is interested. I think there's ways to contact us provided in this session, but that consistency is the key. And if you do have Excel and you have some proficiency, you can do a pivot table. Sometimes that's a quick way to look at what your data is telling you. And Excel can be a really great tool for other things as well. So the ATS isn't an absolute problem solver. That's for sure. Thanks, Debbie, for that question.
Yeah, that was a really great response. I think depending on what companies have available to them, it's nice to know that there are different ways to tackle that. So next question. I think you talked about this a little bit, but maybe this is an opportunity to expand a little bit more. What are some of the techniques you use to attract talent in less diverse areas? For example, many of the people in this session work in very remote areas where they don't have access to transportation isn't quite as convenient, can't call it an Uber, or there's no bus line in those areas. It's more difficult to attract a more diverse workforce. Do you have any suggestions for them?
Yeah, I would go back to, focusing on those community-based organizations. We do a lot of work in a lot of really, really middle of nowhere locations. I mentioned Wittenberg earlier. It's probably one of our largest programs. It's our oldest program. It's been up for 140 years. Not to mention clients are really challenging in that program. We work with male adolescents with victimization issues there. So it's a hard job. Let's start with, it's a really hard job, even if I was in Metro Milwaukee, to recruit for. And it doesn't, pay is not great, although we've increased the comp quite a bit there recently. So what do? I have a large tribal community right there. And so I reached out to the tribal community. I said, okay, what can I do to advertise these opportunities there? I've offered to go out to their community center and do a job fair right there on the tribal lands. I know this tribe is a mile from my program. If I can attract people from the tribe to that program, great. I do a lot of work with DWD in the area as well. Remember, they may be based out of, the largest city there, but they serve your entire county. So yes, I may have somebody sitting in Wausau and be talking to that person at DWD Wausau, but they're going to serve all of Marathon County. And so I do a lot of networking that way.
So DWD is Department of
Workforce development.
development in Wisconsin. Minnesota has something similar with DEED. Illinois and Iowa also. I think every state has some similar programs, and then that's an excellent suggestion. Some other things we've seen are training programs where you might not have like the perfect ideal candidate that you're bringing in, but you're going to do some training programs, or you're going to partner with some vocational schools to get that training, especially if they're really challenging jobs to fill to start out with. We've seen comp premiums starting to, I think, roll out across a lot of these really challenging areas where you're getting some bonuses or you're getting some special incentives to hire. And then the other piece that I think I've heard can be successful is providing transportation. So that would work if you have kind of a cohort group of maybe 10 people, right, who are coming to your facility every day from a generally same region. We do have some manufacturers that have set up and coordinated their own transportation. That has some caveats as well, but if you have a high volume of workers, sometimes that can be a good way to bring people in. That's an
And
excellent
keep in
question.
mind, DWD and even DVR, so the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation, they're out there because they're supposed to be getting people to work. So they may have incentives to help those individuals that you're not even thinking about. I received a phone call from someone from DWD Milwaukee this week on a candidate we were working with. We didn't even know that this individual was working with DVR. And DVR says, okay, we know they're not your ideal candidate. We can offer 90 days of paid work experience. They come and work for you, treat it like an internship, and you get some help, they get some experience. We're actually considering that with this particular job because we felt organizationally this individual would be a great fit if they just had the skill set that they needed to do the role. They have their degree, zero experience. So there may be some incentives. Transportation, I know that there are incentives through the Department of Workforce Development. About 1 million years ago, I feel like I worked for them. And so there's transportation incentives. If you know an individual's, that's their main barrier, potentially there may be options for them out in the community to help with some of that.
Okay, great. I'm going to do a 180 here on the question. Does your organization have just US hires, or do you hire internationally as well? And if so, how does the process differ?
Yeah, we don't do any international work right now.
Okay. Then we'll move on to another question.
I might be able to help with that, Debbie.
It's all yours.
So with the European laws around data and reporting, GDPR, I think it is getting a little bit more complex, especially if systems are interconnected. What we have seen most of our organizations that have global operations where they have to report in the United States, your plans only have to include US-based employees. So you're not even including expats out in necessarily. It's all about reporting structure. But we find that they're only asking questions to US employees that are affirmative action related. So they are not asking those questions beyond any US individuals. And I think that's really important because of course, you can go back to the regulations and say, here's why we're asking the questions in the United States. You definitely don't want to ask those questions as you get into other regions. Even Canada has different equity acts. Europe definitely has a lot of issues around collecting this kind of data. So I would just encourage you not to collect it. And if you had further questions, to talk to an attorney about it, because it's getting to be a really complicated arena to kind of navigate.
Yeah, thank you. That's some really great advice. So Shamara, again, looking at your program, a question was asked about how do you talk about or advertise your diversity referral bonus program so that you can ensure all employees are aware of it and know how to access it or utilize it?
Absolutely. So, like I said, I mean, the biggest way I'm going to do that is through our company newsletter. We've already had one snippet in there. Our newsletter comes out next week, so there'll be another snippet in there. Just making folks aware of that, number one. Number two, it's making sure that your leaders are aware of that as well. I always go back to my leaders and say, hey, when's the last time we asked folks if they had anybody that they would want to refer to us? Have we actually gone out and asked them for referrals? You'd be surprised at how many of my leaders say, no, I didn't even think to do that. And, especially in my more remote areas, the referral bonus may be a little bit different based on location, maybe different based on the job title of the individual. So senior leaders, you get more, that bonus is higher if you're referring those people. But again, then letting folks know, and by the way, if you have individuals who are going to help us reach our DE&I goals or help us reach our affirmative action goals, there may be some additional incentives in that for you. So I think it's, important to make sure that your leaders are having those conversations with their staff too, and actually asking for the referrals.
Thank you. So we are at our end of our presentation. And first, Shamara, I want to just thank you so much for being part of it. I think your expertise and all of the things that you're doing in the area are really exciting. And I hope some of our attendees had some really great takeaways and nuggets to help bring their plans to life. It can be done. We have some resources that will be part of this that you can go ahead and download for those of you who are attending. And you can always reach out to MRA. We have a lot of affirmative action specialists on our team who can help navigate. It's going to be a tricky year with affirmative action, with the certification portal, with OFCCP really hyper-focused again on compliance efforts. We're here. We're here to help. So rest assured, you have some partners and allies in this journey. We are going to head into a short break now. So you can go ahead and log out of this session and you'll be taken into the next session on the agenda page. Thanks again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.